was a Sunday afternoon in 1944, deep in the heart of Texas. The war raged across oceans and continents, but here under the blazing American sun, there was an eerie quiet, broken only by the sound of boots on dry earth and the distant whistle of a train. That train carried prisoners. Not soldiers in chains, but women, German nurses, clerks, and auxiliaries captured in Europe and shipped halfway across the world to a place they'd never even seen on a map. As the doors creaked open, the desert heat wrapped around them like a punishment. Dust swirled around their boots as they stepped out, thin, pale, hollow-eyed. They had survived bombings, hunger, and fear, but what awaited them here in America was something none of them expected. When the American guards, mostly young men, barely older than the women themselves, announced that Sunday pot roasts ready. "Ma'am," the Germans froze. "Pot roast, gravy, vegetables, and warm bread?" They thought it had to be a trick. To them, such food belonged to holidays, not ordinary days. So when the first platter was set down, steaming and rich, one of the women whispered, "Is it Christmas?" The Americans laughed softly, not mockingly, but with the kind of pity that comes from not understanding what starvation does to a person's soul. That meal would become a legend among the camp's prisoners, not because of what was served, but because of what it revealed. That kindness could exist even between enemies, and that sometimes a simple Sunday pot roast could mean more than any victory. The convoy rolled through the dry Texas plains, a line of olive-drab trucks trailing clouds of red dust that shimmered in the noon heat. Inside the last vehicle, a group of German women sat in silence, their khaki uniforms stained, their faces drawn and wary. They had been captured in France, processed in New York, and then shipped south, each step stripping away another layer of certainty. The tag on their chests read, "POW, Female Auxiliary," but no one had explained what that meant here, thousands of miles from the war. Across from them sat Private Jack Turner, a farm boy from Oklahoma with a kind face and sunburned hands. He kept glancing at them, curious but cautious. These weren't the hardened soldiers he'd seen in training posters. They looked more like school teachers who'd wandered into the wrong century. The truck bounced over a rut, jolting Liesl Bauer, a 25-year-old former Red Cross nurse. She caught herself on the bench, muttering under her breath. Across from her, Annika Vogel, once a typist for the Luftwaffe, offered a faint smile, a fragile truce between strangers bound by defeat. When the convoy stopped, the sound of cicadas filled the air. They had arrived at Camp Huntsville, one of the many POW camps built in the American South, barbed wire fences stretching toward the horizon, guard towers standing like silent watchmen. "Out you go," Turner said gently, stepping aside. The women hesitated, shielding their eyes against the sun. The air smelled of pine and dust, a smell both foreign and alive. Major Harlan Reed, the camp's commander, waited near the gate, his uniform pressed, his expression unreadable. "You'll be treated according to the Geneva Convention," he said, his voice carrying authority but not cruelty. "Your behavior will determine your privileges. Follow the rules and life here will be tolerable." Liesl's eyes darted to the American flag fluttering above the headquarters, bright against the pale sky. She hadn't seen such color in months. For a brief second, she wondered how it felt to live in a place untouched by bombings, where the war existed only in radio broadcasts and newspapers. Inside the camp, order replaced fear. Wooden barracks, laundry lines, a mess hall that smelled faintly of coffee. The American guards weren't unkind. They seemed curious more than anything, unsure how to treat female prisoners. Later that afternoon, as the sun dipped lower, Liesl stood by the fence, staring at the horizon. "Do you think they'll feed us?" Annika asked beside her. Liesl shrugged. "If they do, it will be bread and water. It's war, after all." But when the dinner bell rang and the scent of roasted beef drifted through the air, the women turned in disbelief. "Meat?" Annika whispered. Liesl thought it was a dream, until she saw American soldiers carrying steaming trays into the mess hall. None of them knew it yet, but that meal would challenge everything they had been taught about the enemy. The mess hall buzzed with the low murmur of American voices, the clatter of trays, and the warm, impossible aroma of roasted meat and butter. The German women hesitated at the doorway, frozen like statues. Sergeant Bill McAllister, the head cook, a broad-shouldered man from Amarillo, looked up from the serving line. "Go on, ladies," he said, his accent thick with Texas drawl. "Ain't gonna bite ya." They didn't understand his words, but his tone, calm, almost fatherly, cut through the fear. Liesl stepped forward first, her stomach twisting. She hadn't smelled food like this since before the war. Real food, not watery soup or bitter substitutes. Her boots echoed softly on the wooden floor as she approached the counter. Behind it, McAllister was spooning thick brown gravy over slices of pot roast so tender they nearly fell apart. Next to the meat sat clouds of mashed potatoes, creamy and steaming. To the side, green beans glistened with butter, and a basket of dinner rolls waited, soft and golden. When it was Liesl's turn, she clutched her tray like it might vanish. McAllister smiled faintly, lifting his ladle. "Sunday pot roast," he said proudly, setting a generous portion on her plate. She blinked, the words meaningless but the kindness unmistakable. Her lips parted as she whispered to herself in German, "It smells like Christmas." Behind her, Annika covered her mouth with her hands. Greta, another prisoner, actually began to cry, silent tears tracing through the dust on her cheeks. The women moved slowly down the line, their trays filling with food so abundant it felt surreal. They sat together at the far end of the hall, speaking in hushed tones, afraid to appear ungrateful or foolish. For a long moment, no one moved. Then Liesl picked up her fork. The first bite of tender beef broke her composure. Her eyes filled instantly and her breath caught. "Is this real?" she murmured. Annika nodded, chewing slowly, tears streaming down her face. "If this is captivity," she said, half laughing, half sobbing, "then maybe freedom was the lie." Across the room, Sergeant McAllister and Lieutenant Sarah Coleman, the camp nurse, watched quietly. Sarah had seen starvation before, in photographs from Europe, but nothing compared to watching it melt away in real time, replaced by disbelief and relief. McAllister leaned toward her. "They look like my sisters did during the Dust Bowl," he muttered. "Hungry, proud, and too tired to ask for help." Sarah nodded. "Feed them, Bill. Feed them until they believe they're safe." As dusk settled outside, the mess hall glowed with warm light. The German women ate until their hands trembled. Some saved bits of bread and napkins, unable to trust that food would come again tomorrow. Others simply stared at their plates, trying to memorize every flavor, every smell. When Liesl finally set down her fork, she whispered, "They said this is Sunday pot roast. But for us..." She looked around the table at her friends' tear-streaked faces. "It tastes like peace." The first night after the meal, the camp was unusually quiet. The kind of silence that follows a storm, not of wind, but of emotion. Inside the barracks, 40 German women lay on narrow bunks, the smell of soap and cooked food still lingering on their clothes. For hours, no one spoke. Then the groans began. Annika sat up, clutching her stomach. The pain came in waves, sharp, twisting, merciless. Beside her, Greta whimpered, curled into herself like a child. On the far end, Liesl sat on the floor, breathing through clenched teeth, sweat beading on her pale forehead. The feast that had felt like salvation now felt like punishment. Their bodies, long accustomed to near starvation, rebelled violently against the sudden abundance. Lieutenant Sarah Coleman arrived first, hair unpinned, coat thrown hastily over her nightgown. "What happened?" she demanded. Corporal Davis, the guard on duty, looked helpless. "Ma'am, they're all sick. Every one of them." Sarah moved quickly from bunk to bunk, assessing. "Refeeding shock," she muttered. "Their systems can't handle the fat, the sugar." "Not yet." She turned toward Davis. "Get the doctor, now." Moments later, Dr. Walter Haynes, the camp physician, arrived with his medical bag and an expression of grim understanding. He had seen malnutrition in prisoner reports, but seeing it in flesh and blood was different. The hollow faces, the trembling hands, the sheer fragility of these women who had once worn military uniforms. Haynes knelt beside Liesl. "You'll be all right," he said softly, voice steady. "Your body just needs time." She didn't understand his English, but the tone calmed her. Her lips formed a single word. "Danke." The doctor stayed until dawn. Buckets were emptied, water distributed, foreheads wiped. Sarah never left their side. By morning, exhaustion hung in the air like mist. Sergeant Bill McAllister came to the infirmary, guilt heavy in his eyes. "I cooked for him like I'd cook for my own," he said quietly to Sarah. Didn't think. She cut him off gently. You showed kindness, Bill, that's not a mistake. But he still looked unconvinced. Later that afternoon, Haynes gathered the camp staff. No more heavy meals, he ordered. We'll rebuild them slowly by broth, eggs, soft bread. 5 small portions a day. We go too fast again, we'll kill them. Sarah took notes while McAllister nodded solemnly. Guess we'll start over, he said. Like feeding newborns. In the days that followed, the women began to recover. Weak, pale, but alive. Their trust in food, and in the people feeding them, grew one careful spoonful at a time. Liesel wrote in her journal, a tattered notebook she'd carried through the war. I did not know kindness could hurt this way. The food that made me sick also made me believe again. Perhaps that is how mercy works. It fills you until you ache. In the kitchen, McAllister adjusted every recipe. He replaced butter with broth, sugar with mashed vegetables. When Liesel and Annika began helping him clean the kitchen as a gesture of gratitude, he showed them how to peel potatoes safely, his rough hands surprisingly gentle. Sometimes they spoke in broken English and fragments of German, laughing at the confusion of words. It wasn't much, but it was the beginning of understanding. At night, Sarah walked past the women's quarters and heard something she hadn't expected, quiet humming. A tune, soft and sad but undeniably human. The sound of women who had remembered what it meant to live. And for the first time since the camp's gates had closed behind them, she allowed herself to believe that compassion could rebuild what war had shattered. By the 3rd week, the kitchen had become a sanctuary. The clang of pots, the hiss of boiling water, the rhythm of knives against cutting boards. It was the first place in months where work felt normal, not punishment. Liesel stood beside Sergeant Bill McAllister, sleeves rolled to her elbows, peeling potatoes with mechanical precision. Across the counter, Greta kneaded dough under Sarah Coleman's supervision, flour streaking her cheeks like war paint. The smell of yeast filled the air, thick and warm, the smell of life. For the American staff, the sight of former enemies working quietly among them had stopped being strange. War had a way of exhausting hatred, not bad, huh? Bill said, glancing at Liesel's neat pile of peeled potatoes. She looked up, unsure what he'd said. He mimed, clapping. Good, very good. She smiled, unshyly but genuinely, and replied in halting English. I learn fast, Sarah chuckled. That's the truth. Language had become their shared frontier. Each morning, Sarah brought flashcards she'd made from scrap paper. Knife, salt, flour, bowl. The German women repeated the words, sometimes serious, sometimes laughing at their own mispronunciations. Liesel started keeping her own list, writing German beside English, whispering the words at night until they became muscle memory. One afternoon, Sarah pointed to herself and said, Hey, Sarah. Then she pointed to Liesel. You? Liesel, she replied softly. Sarah nodded. Liesel, she repeated, savoring the foreign sound. Pretty. It was a small exchange. But in that moment, Liesel felt seen, not as a prisoner, not as an enemy, but as a person. Later that day, Sarah found Liesel humming the same tune she'd heard outside the barracks, the quiet melody that had haunted the night air. What's that song? Sarah asked. Liesel hesitated, then said, Song from before the war. She nodded. My mother sang for sleep. Sarah didn't ask more. Some memories didn't need translation. By December, the women's color had returned, their steps surer. They ate small meals regularly now, eggs, broth, oatmeal. Their bodies adjusted. Their spirits, too. One morning, a Red Cross truck arrived with supplies, powdered milk, soap, and, unexpectedly, a crate of books in English and German. Sarah distributed them carefully. When Liesel opened hers, a battered copy of Jane Eyre, she traced the words like sacred text. She didn't understand most of them yet, but she would. In the evenings, they gathered near the stove, trading stories in a blend of languages and gestures. Greta told how she once worked as a nurse in Hamburg. Bill shared tales of growing up on a tobacco farm in Kentucky. They laughed more than they cried, though tears came too, quiet, unashamed. One night, after the others had gone, Bill lingered by the sink while Liesel dried the last plate. You know, he said, not meeting her eyes, you remind me of my sister. Liesel frowned, confused. Sister? He smiled. Yeah, always worrying about everyone but herself. She tilted her head, understanding only half his words but all his tone. Good, sister, she said softly. Bill nodded, his throat tightening. Yeah, the best. When he left, Liesel turned off the lantern. The kitchen plunged into darkness except for moonlight spilling through the window. For the first time since the war began, she felt something like peace. Fragile, incomplete, but real. In her journal that night, she wrote, "Today I made bread with an American. It did not matter that I was German. The dough rose just the same." The mail truck came on a gray morning in late January, carrying with it a weight no one could prepare for. The camp's loudspeakers called out names slowly, each syllable heavy, each pause filled with breathless hope. Liesel hadn't expected her name. She had written home months ago through the Red Cross, but the chances of a letter reaching Germany felt like a prayer cast into a storm. Yet there it was, her name, pronounced awkwardly by the clerk. Letter for Liesel Baumann. Her hands trembled as she stepped forward. The envelope was thin, the paper soft and creased from travel across oceans. The handwriting was unmistakable, her father's, shaky but alive. She clutched it to her chest and walked out behind the kitchen, to the field where frost clung to the earth. When she finally opened it, her breath caught. Meine liebe Tochter. The words blurred as tears filled her eyes. Her father was alive, yes, but her mother was gone. A bombing in Stuttgart had taken the bakery, their home, and everything inside. The letter ended abruptly, as if written in haste, with a line that broke her heart open. If you can, stay where you are. The war is over, but there is nothing here. Inside the barracks, similar grief unfolded in whispers and sobs. Greta fell to her knees as she read of her brother's execution for desertion. Hilda's hand shook as she learned her village had been taken by the Soviets. Even the strongest among them wept like children who had been holding their breath too long. That night, Sarah Coleman found Liesel sitting alone in the mess hall. The letter spread out on the table like an open wound. Bad news? She asked gently. Liesel didn't answer right away. Mother dead, she said finally, voice flat. Home, gone, Sarah sat across from her. I'm so sorry, Liesel's eyes lifted. He say, stay where you are. She hesitated, searching for words. He say, nothing left. Sarah swallowed hard. She wanted to say something comforting, something wise. But there were no right words for this kind of loss. So she reached across the table and covered Liesel's trembling hand with her own. They sat like that for a long time, the silence saying everything. The next few days were different. The kitchen still smelled of bread and broth, but laughter came less easily. The women worked quietly, their movements deliberate, as if clinging to routine was the only way to keep from falling apart. One evening, Bill walked in carrying a record player borrowed from the officers' quarters. Thought you might need a bit of music, he said, setting it down on the counter. When the needle dropped, the room filled with the scratchy voice of Bing Crosby singing I'll Be Seeing You. The lyrics hit like a knife wrapped in velvet. Liesel stopped kneading dough and just listened, the melody washing over her. I'll be seeing you. In all the old familiar places. A tear slid down her cheek unnoticed. Sarah turned away, pretending to check the oven. Bill leaned against the wall, hat in hand, staring at nothing. For the first time, Americans and Germans cried together, not as enemies, but as people who had all lost something to the same cruel machine. When the record ended, nobody spoke. Only the soft hum of the needle against vinyl filled the room. That night, Liesel wrote in her journal, Today I learned that home can be destroyed, but kindness can build a new one. By March, the Mississippi winter had given way to soft, muddy mornings and pale sunlight that crept through the barracks' windows. The camp felt different now, less like a prison, more like a small, fragile village held together by chores, laughter, and shared hunger. Liesel had begun helping Sergeant Bill Tucker in the kitchen full-time. She was quick to learn, eager to please, and always curious. One morning she watched as Bill seasoned a large slab of beef and set it into a roasting pan. What is this? She asked, tilting her head. Sunday pot roast, Bill said, grinning. Every American family eats this on Sundays. Potatoes, carrots, onions, slow cooked all day long. Liesel nodded thoughtfully. Like German Rinderbraten, she said, smiling faintly. But this smells different, Bill chuckled. That's because you Germans cook with rules. We cook with stories. That line stayed with her all day. As the roast simmered, the smell drifted through the camp, rich, comforting, and almost holy. By late afternoon, even the guards were standing near the mess hall door, pretending to check supplies just to breathe it in. When the bell rang for supper, the German women entered slowly, eyes widening. The long wooden tables were covered with steaming plates of roast beef, mashed potatoes, and gravy so thick it clung to the spoon. "This," Greta whispered, "this looks like Christmas." Sarah, wearing a red apron marked with a white cross, laughed softly. "Close enough." The Cowboys said it's Sunday. The women hesitated at first. Even after months of kindness, the idea of eating the same meal as their captors felt strange, almost forbidden. But when Bill called out, "Dig in, ladies," with his usual cheerful tone, something inside them broke open. Liesl took the first bite. The flavor was deep and savory, melting on her tongue. It wasn't just food, but it was warmth, belonging, and forgiveness all served on one plate. Tears welled up in her eyes. "It tastes like home," she whispered. Across the table, Elsa clasped her hands together. "But not our home," she said softly. "A better one." The room filled with quiet laughter, the kind born not from joy but from relief. For the first time since capture, they weren't just surviving, they were living. As dinner went on, the lines between prisoner and guard blurred further. Bill told jokes about his mother's cooking. Sarah taught Liesl how to make gravy the American way. Greta shared stories about her family's bakery back in Bremen. When one of the younger soldiers brought out a phonograph and started playing a country tune, the most unexpected thing happened. Else stood up and began to dance. She held her apron like a skirt, swaying clumsily to the rhythm. A few of the others joined in, giggling like schoolgirls. Even Bill couldn't resist tapping his boots against the floor. Sarah leaned against the doorway, watching it all unfold with a smile that was equal parts joy and ache. She whispered under her breath, "If peace had a sound, it would be laughter like this." Outside, the sky turned gold, the camp's fences casting long shadows across the ground. Inside, for one sacred hour, the war truly ended, not with treaties or signatures, but with a shared meal and a shared silence afterward, as everyone sat too full to speak. Later, Liesl wrote in her journal, "They called it Sunday pot roast. We thought it was Christmas dinner. But really, it was a piece of peace." By summer, the war in Europe was over. The camp that once held prisoners now felt like a forgotten village waiting for its people to leave. The barbed wire still stood, but it no longer meant the same thing. Colonel Anderson received new orders in June. Prepare female POWs for repatriation. The news spread through Camp Cottonwood like a chill wind. For the American soldiers, it meant the mission was almost complete. For the German women, it meant the end of the only stability they had known in years. Liesl sat on her bunk that night, tracing her finger over the pages of her small notebook. English words, recipes, and phrases she had copied from Sergeant Tucker's kitchen lessons. Across from her, Greta packed slowly, folding her uniform with mechanical precision. "Do you think we'll ever see this place again?" Greta asked quietly. Liesl shook her head. "No, but maybe we will see what it gave us." Outside, the mess hall lights glowed. Tucker was cleaning the stoves one last time, while Sarah sat on the porch steps staring into the distance. She had grown close to the women, too close, some said, but she no longer cared about rumors. These weren't enemies anymore. They were survivors. The next morning, the women were assembled in neat rows near the transport trucks. The American flag fluttered above them, bright and clean in the southern sun. Colonel Anderson stepped forward, his tone solemn. "Ladies," he began, "you came here as soldiers of a nation we fought. You leave as women who showed courage, dignity, and grace under hardship. I hope when you rebuild your homeland you remember this. We saw you not as enemies but as human beings." Liesl translated his words into German, her voice trembling. Some women cried openly. Then Tucker appeared from behind the colonel, carrying a large metal pot and several wrapped parcels. He set them on the table beside the trucks. "Before you go," he said, "I figured you should have one last Sunday meal." The smell of roast beef and gravy drifted through the air. A few of the women gasped, "Sunday pot roast." Liesl's eyes filled instantly. "Bill," you remembered. "Hard to forget a bunch of ladies who cleaned my kitchen better than I ever did," he replied with a grin, though his own eyes shimmered. They ate in silence at first, sitting on the steps, plates in their laps. The food was simple, but to them it tasted like everything they would miss about this strange American camp. Safety, kindness, and dignity. After the meal, Sarah walked over to Liesel and pressed something into her hand, a folded piece of paper. "It's a reference letter," Sarah said softly. "If you ever come back to America, show this. Maybe it'll open a door for you." Liesel clutched the paper to her chest. "You think I could come back?" "I think you already belong here," Sarah said. That night, when the trucks finally rolled away, the women leaned out the back, waving through tears as the camp disappeared into the dust. Tucker stood beside Sarah, his hand raised until the last truck vanished. Years later, in 1968, a woman walked into a diner in Texas. Her accent was faint, her English fluent. She ordered Sunday pot roast. When the waitress asked how she knew the dish, she smiled faintly. "I learned it a long time ago," she said, "from a cowboy who believed kindness could end wars. If this story moved you, share it." Because sometimes history isn't written by generals or politicians. It's written by people who choose compassion over hate, and by those who remember that even in war, a meal can be a miracle.